The quest for absolute truth has been man's quest from the beginning. It is in that quest that difficult questions are asked. The motive of those questions should be founded on a sincere desire to test everything. In this series, we embark on the challenge of testing the teachings and claims of what is often referred to as the New Testament of the Bible, or also called in Hebrew, the Brit Hadashah. We hope that you enjoy studying and testing the following teaching. It is not uncommon for Jewish commentary to point out that Jesus, we often refer to him as his Hebrew name being Yeshua, did not fulfill all the messianic prophecies. You might hear those who promote this message being called anti-missionaries or counter-missionaries. Such groups bring a lot of questions and debates to the table, and often difficult, challenging questions at that. For example, modern Jewish rabbis object at the idea that some prophecies are for a later time and that there is to be a second coming of the Messiah. There is a reason for this modern position. Have you ever wondered how ancient Jewish rabbis interpreted messianic prophecies and how such might compare to modern Jewish understanding? Also, did you realize that the Torah reveals not only how the Messiah was to come twice, but also about when we should expect him both times? This teaching will touch on both of these subjects. We will examine what ancient rabbis taught as it related to the Messiah, what modern rabbis teach and believe, and even examine some interesting insight revealed in the Torah about the timing of the Messiah. Modern Jewish commentary rejects the concept of two messianic comings. Yet certain ancient rabbinical writings actually taught two messianic comings. Why the difference? What changed with what was once taught by rabbis versus what is taught today in typical Jewish circles? Ancient Jewish rabbis noticed that messianic prophecies appear to contain a dichotomy. Some messianic prophecies appear to be mutually exclusive, as though it was not possible for prophecies to be of the same Messiah. Ancient Jewish rabbinical writings, in an attempt to reconcile this tension in messianic prophecy, assigned a name to each one of these messiahs, one being Messiah ben Yosef, and the other being Messiah ben David. Generally, Messiah ben David is assigned to all the messianic prophecies related to the kingdom, and Messiah ben Yosef is assigned to the prophecies related to the suffering servant. Of course, there are various doctrinal differences in attempting to understand the details, meaning some of the rabbis differ on specifics, but some of the common denominators are that there are two messiahs separated by a distance of time. We're not going to pretend that rabbis did not differ on some of these matters, or that any particular rabbi had all messianic prophecy interpreted correctly in advance. However, it should be interesting to note that Jewish scholarship already proposed a means to deal with these seemingly opposing messianic prophecies in such a way that required two messiahs at two different times. As a necessary disclosure, 119 Ministries believes that Yeshua in the first century, also known as Jesus in mainstream Christian circles, satisfied the messianic type of Messiah ben Yosef, and we also believe that he will return and establish the role of Messiah ben David. We believe such because we believe the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, to conclusively detail out in advance, in the form of messianic prophecy, the specific events that led to the accounts found in the New Testament, or also known as the Brit Hadashah. Meaning this, according to the Old Testament prophecy, the Tanakh, it was necessary that the New Testament, or Brit Hadashah, occurred how and when it did. Most Jewish objection to Yeshua as the Messiah centers around the misunderstanding perpetuated by mainstream Christians, specifically that Yeshua, or Jesus, changed the law of God. Most Jews know that the Messiah could not change the law of God, as that would violate nearly every known messianic prophecy and violate the very definition of a true prophet as detailed in Deuteronomy 13 and 18. In other words, the common presentation of the Messiah to Jews by mainstream Christianity presents a man that forces a Jew to interpret him as a false prophet, because mainstream Christianity has a Messiah changing the law of God. 119 Ministries also believes that the law of God, or Torah, also stands intact today. We present Yeshua as the Messiah, leaving the law of God completely intact, meaning Yeshua is completely compatible with Deuteronomy 13. So although we have tested the subject and arrived to these conclusions, our goal in this teaching is not to project our conclusions onto you. What we will do is demonstrate how Jewish rabbis already interpreted messianic prophecy in such a way that was conducive to the validity of the Brit Hadashah or New Testament writings. What we also find is that many of the modern Jewish rabbis no longer interpret messianic prophecies in the same way that they once did. The reason for this is because most of modern Jewish doctrine is built on the framework of one particular rabbi who made every attempt to avoid such conclusions. There are still many other reasons why mainstream Judaism has a difficult time acknowledging Yeshua as the Messiah detailed in the Tanakh. Our focus on this teaching will be on the issue as to whether the Messiah was to come twice. Currently, mainstream Judaism does not see one Messiah with two comings as a reality. However, it is still interesting to note that ancient Judaism did see two messianic comings to some degree, as we already mentioned in the form of Messiah ben Yosef and Messiah ben David. Let's first examine Messiah ben Yosef. In the 12th chapter of the prophet Zechariah it is written, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem in the spirit of grace and supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him, like the bitter weeping over a firstborn." To this the rabbis respond, "This is Mashiach ben Yosef, who is to be slain." In Zechariah, we read that Yahweh was to pour out the spirit of grace and supplication, and that he was to be pierced. For those that are familiar with the New Testament accounts, the parallels to Zechariah 12 is absolutely striking. John chapter 19. "And when they came to Yeshua and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you may also believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken." And again, another scripture says, "They will look on him whom they have pierced." Here John quotes what we just read in Zechariah 12. They will look on him whom they have pierced. But he also quotes Psalm chapter 34. He keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. In this instance, we have Jewish rabbis interpreting Zechariah 12 to be referring to the Messiah, and the Brit Hadashah account in John confirming that it did indeed happen. One of the most debated chapters in all the Tanakh is about the Messiah ben Yosef found in Isaiah 53. The debate is whether Isaiah 53 is only about Israel or is also about the Messiah. Anti-missionaries and modern rabbis will often testify up and down that Isaiah 53 is only about Israel and has nothing to do with the Messiah. Most modern rabbis will passionately insist that Isaiah 53 cannot be and is not about the Messiah, but instead only about Israel. The Talmud, which is basically a collection of Jewish commentary on the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, reveals some insight that is not all too compatible with the more modern understanding of Isaiah 53. The Talmud explains in regards to Isaiah 53. The Messiah, what is his name? Those of the house of Rabbi Judah, the saints say, the sick one, as it is said, surely he has borne our sickness, referring to Isaiah 53. It has also been said, but he was wounded, meaning that since the Messiah bears our iniquities, which produce the effect of his being bruised, it follows that whosoever will not admit that Messiah thus suffers for our iniquities must endure and suffer for them for himself. Here we have Jewish rabbis, contrary to modern Jewish doctrine, testifying that Isaiah 53 is indeed about the Messiah. However, before we really dig deep into Isaiah 53, we might question why this is even important or necessary. The reality is that as some have begun exploring their Hebrew roots, after realizing that hundreds of years of mainstream Christianity err, some take faith that they once had in men in Christianity and then start misplacing their faith in rabbis in Judaism. But the sad reality is that both sides of the fence have much error. Just as mainstream Christianity, in error, latches onto traditions that abolish the law of God, mainstream Judaism projects much faith and credibility into rabbis that make a point to change the context and distance themselves from messianic texts. This means that we need to be very careful and be sure to test everything. There's a ditch on each side of the narrow path. Regardless of what traditions and doctrinal baggage we are coming out of, we need to be sure that we are not eager to simply jump into the other ditch on the other side of the narrow path. One of the easiest ways to illustrate this point is on the matter of Isaiah 53. Just as mainstream Christianity has their traditions of their fathers, so does mainstream Judaism. The rabbi who has framed and shaped much of modern doctrinal thought in Judaism is Rashi. It is understood by many other Jewish rabbis that Rashi, around the late 11th century, intentionally changed the context of Isaiah 53 to be about Israel instead of the Messiah. That is not our claim about Rashi, but actually other Jewish commentators, which we'll show you momentarily. Rashi proceeded with this doctrinal shift despite the fact that other great rabbis, such as Maimonides and Crispin, profess that the central theme of Isaiah 53 is prophetically messianic. Most agree that Rashi established this change because of his strong anti-Christian mentality, a fact in which he freely admitted. He made no attempt to hide his doctrinal bias or the fact that his commentary was diverting away from hundreds of years of Jewish messianic interpretation, solely in an intentional attempt to distance one's doctrine and conclusions from professed Christians. In his defense, as a Jew, it would have been very easy to have an anti-Christian mentality, given the violent anti-Semitism that occurred for hundreds of years in supposed Christian camps. Christians certainly did not live like they believed the Bible to be truth, and did not preach an interpretation of the Messiah that was consistent with what the Old Testament demanded. Meaning this: Christianity professed that the law of God changed, and that the Torah changed and no longer applied. Because of this error, and because Christians did not walk the law of God, Jews distanced themselves greatly from the inaccurate presentation of Yeshua, our Messiah. They ran from it, and rightfully so. But unfortunately, because Christians misunderstood the writings of Paul, many Jews from the 3rd century on have not realized fulfillments of the messianic prophecy that occurred in the 1st century. Sadly, Christians not only did not walk the Word of God in the presence of the Jews, but they also distorted Yeshua's beliefs and teachings to such a degree that forced Jews to not be able to accept such doctrine. If you are confused or need clarification on what we just said, pause this teaching and watch our teaching titled The Deuteronomy 13 Test at testeverything.net. To be fair as possible, Rashi had every right to be against Christianity, and because Christianity used Isaiah 53 to justify the New Testament scriptures, Rashi changed the context of Isaiah 53. Now please understand, as we revealed earlier, we believe the New Testament writings to be valid and true. We love our Christian brothers and sisters. We love our Jewish brothers and sisters. We simply believe that mainstream Jewish doctrines need to leave traditions of men that are not compatible with the Tanakh and discover the fulfillments of messianic prophecy that occurred in the 1st century. We also believe that mainstream Christianity needs to realize the Hebraic aspects of the Messiah, realize that the Tanakh or Old Testament contains prophecy that demands that the law of God could not change and would not change in the New Covenant. Thus, both camps have issues to deal with. We simply believe that hundreds of years of Christianity made some serious errors in doctrine pertaining to the law of God, and because of those errors, Jews were forced to reject Yeshua, or Jesus, as their Messiah. Much of this error is due to a misunderstanding of Paul's writings. For more on this, please see our teaching series called The Pauline Paradox. Let's read the chapter in question, starting with Isaiah 52, verse 13, and then we will discuss the debate in more detail as it relates to Rashi. We will then read this portion in Isaiah and attempt to determine for ourselves whether the context is about Israel or the Messiah. Then, we will look more at what the ancient rabbis believed versus what Rabbi Rashi taught and believed, and how that shapes current modern Jewish doctrine. As a side note, we realize that there are many complexities in labeling groups of people with similar beliefs. We fully understand that there are Jews who know their Messiah, Yeshua. We realize that there are Orthodox Jews. We know there are Karaite Jews. We know that there's everything in between and around. We do not wish to offend, but recognize and respect these differences. For the sake of simplicity of this teaching, more than often, when we use the term Jews, we're simply using that term to refer to Orthodox Jews. That being said, let's continue. Sadly, and quite revealing, Jews usually do not include Isaiah 53 in the Haftorah. The Haftorah is a list of scheduled scriptures that are read throughout every year. This particular reading schedule is a tradition that developed in the dispersion, when they lived in countries that outlawed the Torah, but allowed them to read the prophets. Just as Christianity has casual Christians who maybe go to church on Christmas and Easter, or possibly every Sunday, to only hear what is read or preached, Judaism has casual Jews who simply listen to what the rabbis read and never really do any self-study. Because Isaiah 53 is usually passed over in these annual readings in the synagogues, many Jews have never even read that chapter. It is very possible that if you ever encounter a discussion with a professed Jew, that they have never read Isaiah 53. But there are those that have, and also adopted a very non-messianic perspective about that chapter. The point is this: what would you do if an anti-missionary came to you and said that Isaiah 53 is only about Israel and not the Messiah? That Isaiah 53 having a messianic theme is a complete fabrication of Christians? How would you answer that? Is it only a fabrication of Christians? Well, to answer that question, naturally, we'd want to start by reading Isaiah 53. As we said earlier, the Jewish readings skip right over Isaiah 52 and 53. In the Deuteronomy readings, the Haftorah portions go from Isaiah 51 verse 12 to Isaiah chapter 52, verse 12. Skip over Isaiah 52, verse 13 to Isaiah 53, and pick back up at Isaiah 54, verse 1. Herbert Lowe, a Cambridge University rabbinics professor, notes, quotations from the famous 53rd chapter of Isaiah are rare in rabbinic literature. Because of the Christological interpretation given to the chapter by Christians, it is omitted from the series of prophetic lessons, the Haftorah, for the Deuteronomy Sabbaths. The omission is deliberate and striking. Striking indeed, but it also has quite the impact in shaping Jewish doctrine in the synagogues. The Torah portion and Haftorah reading schedule is used by Jews in synagogues all over the world. So the doctrinal impact of this intentional omission is quite significant indeed. They intentionally avoid and neglect what we are about to read. Let's see if Isaiah 53 is only about Israel or the Messiah's relationship with Israel. Let's see what they are missing. Let's begin. Isaiah 52, verse 13. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted. To be fair, the previous verses in Isaiah 52 were indeed about Israel. And in fact, all of the preceding chapters were about Israel. And here, in the middle of Isaiah 52, we see a mention to my servant. In the Tanakh, the Old Testament, Israel is indeed referred to as Yahweh's servant. However, this still could be a reference to the Messiah. We need to continue to glean more context. Isaiah 52, verse 14 and 15. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. Isaiah 53. Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Question. Where in the Tanakh is Israel referred to as the right arm of Yahweh? If Isaiah 53 is indeed about Israel, should we not be able to find additional scriptural confirmation of Israel being referred to as the arm of Yahweh? Let's continue. For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. Question. If Isaiah 53 is about Israel, and only Israel, meaning Israel is the he, then who is the we here? How can Israel be both the he and the we in the same context? Already, the Isaiah 53 as only Israel belief is appearing quite shaky. Let's continue. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. And as one whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Again, there's a difference between the he and the we. The we is known to be Israel. So, the he cannot be Israel. The he, the arm of Yahweh, must be someone else. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Again, a difference between the we as Israel and the him as someone else. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. So the our must be about Israel, which begs the question again, who is the he? Now, unlike Rashi, other Jewish rabbis believe this to be about the Messiah. For example, as we read earlier, when Zechariah 12 is cited about he who is pierced, and like Isaiah 53 also states, Jewish commentary refers to him as the Messiah who is to be slain. This is Mashiach ben Joseph, who is to be slain. Certainly one would not believe that Israel was pierced and slain for Israel's own transgressions. Is Israel dead? Did Israel die and is nowhere to be found? Of course not. The he who is to be pierced and slain must be someone other than Israel. In addition, that person is slain for Israel's transgressions. Hebrews chapter 9. Therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. Was the author of Hebrews just making this up while noting first century events? Or was he referencing Isaiah 53? Let's continue with Isaiah 53. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned, every one, to his own way. So Israel is healed by someone else's wounds. and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Again, Israel's iniquity was laid on someone else. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. The he, which is different than Israel, is referred to as a lamb. John chapter 1. And he looked at Yeshua, Jesus, as he walked by and said, Behold, the Lamb of God. Continuing with Isaiah 53. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off from the land of the living. So if Israel is the he, then when did Israel die and was cut off from the land of the living? Are there no more Israelites today? Have they all been killed? Are they no longer among us? Again, the he must be someone else who was slain. Stricken for the transgression of my people, and they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. Question. If the my people is Israel, then how can Israel be stricken for the transgression of Israel? Continuing on. Although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. He did no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth? How can the he be Israel in light of Jeremiah? When was Israel ever considered to be innocent? Is Israel innocent? Jeremiah chapter 3. She saw that for all the adulteries of that faithless one, Israel, I had sent her away with a decree of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she too went and played the whore. This is a very important question. How can Israel be innocent and able also to die for a not innocent Israel? How can Israel be innocent and not innocent at the same time? Let's continue examining Isaiah 53. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. We find that the he has been abused, crushed, and killed for the transgressions of Israel. And here we find that this is Yahweh's will, that this innocent man be sacrificed for the sake of Israel's transgressions to literally crush him. Let's continue. He has put him to grief when his soul makes an offering for guilt. He shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall one righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. So this man makes many righteous by bearing their iniquities through the anguish of his soul, when his soul becomes an offering for Israel's guilt. Again, how can Israel die for Israel? How can a blemished Israel be a guilt offering for a blemished Israel? How could that make any sense whatsoever? Typical modern Jewish commentary teaches that a man cannot become a guilt offering for someone else by bearing their iniquities when they are crushed or slain. Yet, here it is, right in the Tanakh. Unfortunately, this chapter is skipped over in annual readings, effectively hiding it from the masses. You don't have to explain what most do not see, or so the theory goes. Moving on. Therefore, I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, which makes intercession for the transgressors. Without question, it must be interpreted that Isaiah 53 is a messianic prophecy. Isaiah 53 cannot only be about Israel. As we said earlier, most modern Judaism does not believe Isaiah 53 to be a messianic prophecy, simply because of the doctrine of Rabbi Rashi. This is not a big secret, but something that is already known. The weight of Jewish authority preponderates in favor of messianic interpretation of this chapter, that until recent times, this prophecy has been almost universally received by Jews as referring to Messiah, is evident from Targum Jonathan, who introduced Messiah by name from the Talmud and from Zohar, and in fact, until Rabbi Rashi, considered the originator of the modern school of Jewish interpretation, who applied it to the Jewish nation, the messianic interpretation of this chapter was almost universally adopted by Jews. Here we are told that Rashi is the main cause of the belief that Isaiah 53 is not of messianic interpretation. He even quotes the Sanhedrin. But is that true? Are other rabbis of the opinion that Isaiah 53 is a messianic prophecy? Is this why the portion that we just read in Isaiah is avoided in annual Jewish readings? Let's read other rabbinical commentary on Isaiah 53. From Targum, Behold, my servant the Messiah shall prosper. Targum's commentary on Isaiah 53 mentions that this servant is the Messiah. Yet the word Messiah is not found anywhere in Isaiah 52 or 53, clearly demonstrating the belief that Isaiah 53 is centric to the role of the Messiah. Another. We know that messianic homilies based on Joseph's career, his saving role preceded by suffering, and using Isaiah 53 as the prophetic portion, were preached in certain old synagogues which used the triennial cycle. Here the understanding is established that not only is Isaiah 53 messianic, but related to the story of Joseph and his suffering, hence the concept of Messiah ben Yosef. Meaning this, the Messiah, as YashaYaH ben Yosef, or Messiah son of Joseph, simply means that Joseph is a type of role for the Messiah. Even more astounding, this understanding was preached in old synagogues long ago. The Talmud. The rabbi said, his name is the leper scholar, as it is written, surely he hath borne griefs, and carried out our sorrows, yet we did esteem him a leper, smitten of God, and afflicted. If Isaiah 53 is only about Israel, then why are so many rabbis saying it is not only about Israel, but also about the Messiah? Good question. Why is the very commentary of Jews proving the validity of New Testament writings? The next quote interprets Ruth to illustrate a hidden parallel to the Messiah and even relates it back to Isaiah 53. The fifth interpretation of Ruth chapter 2 makes it refer to the Messiah. Come hither approach to royal state, and eat of the bread refers to the bread of royalty, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar refers to his sufferings, as it is said, but he was wounded because of our transgressions. Let's read this verse in Ruth 2:14. And at mealtime Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread, and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. This interpretation of Ruth, in which the Messiah is the bread, is consistent with the testimony of the Brit Hadashah. John chapter 6. So the Jews grumbled about him, because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. John chapter 6. I am the bread of life. Matthew chapter 26. And now as they're eating, Yeshua took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples, and said, take, eat, this is my body. Again, why are the rabbis giving an interpretation of Isaiah 53 as the Messiah if it is only about Israel? The next quote is from a Karaite Jew. There are different denominations that exist in what is often referred to as Judaism. A Karaite Jew literally means to be a scripturalist. They make every attempt to simply call a scripture as they see it. They do not try to find the deeper meanings of Scripture. They make every attempt to only focus on the plain meaning of the text. This quote is from the 10th century, well before Rabbi Rashi began teaching the idea that Isaiah 53 was only about Israel and not about the Messiah. As to myself, I am inclined, with Benjamin Nahawand, to regard it as alluding to the Messiah. This, of course, is referring to Isaiah 53, and note that he is agreeing with another ancient rabbi. And as opening with a description of his condition in exile, from the time of his birth to his ascension to the throne, for the prophet begins by speaking of his being seated in a position of great honor. This is found in Isaiah 52, verses 13 through 15. And then goes back to relate all that will happen to him during the captivity. He thus gives us to understand two things. In the first instance, that the Messiah will only reach his highest degree of honor after long and severe trials. So first, suffering servant, and then as king, it's a two-part process. And secondly, that these trials will be sent upon him as a kind of sign, so that, if he finds himself under the yoke of misfortunes, whilst remaining pure in his actions, he may know that he is the desired one. Here is another statement by the same Karaite rabbi. By the words, surely he hath carried our sickness. They mean that the pains and sickness which he fell into were merited by them. The them in this statement means Israel. But that he bore them instead. And here, I think it necessary to pause for a few moments in order to explain why God caused these sicknesses to attach themselves to the Messiah for the sake of Israel. The nation deserved from God greater punishment than that which actually came upon them. But not being strong enough to bear it, God appoints his servant to carry their sins, and by doing so, lighten their punishment in order that Israel might not be completely exterminated. This understanding, of course, explains why Israel is mentioned as the servant before Isaiah 52. But mid-Isaiah 52 onward, the head servant role is attributed to a messianic figure in order to help Israel accomplish what they're always supposed to accomplish, which is to bring the Torah to the nations. So why do literal Karaite rabbis teach that Isaiah 53 is about the Messiah It is only supposed to be about the nation of Israel. This very next rabbinical quote is interesting. It directly states that Messiah ben Yosef will be slain, and then Messiah ben David will come, also referring to Isaiah 53. And then Armelaus will join battle with Messiah, the son of Ephraim, in the east gate, and Messiah, son of Ephraim. This is a reference to Messiah ben Yosef, will die there, and Israel will mourn for him, and afterwards the Holy One will reveal to them Messiah, the son of David, whom Israel will desire to stone, saying, Thou speakest falsely, already is the Messiah slain, and there is none other Messiah to stand up after him. So they will despise him, as it is written, despised and forlorn of men. But he will turn and hide himself from them, according to the words, like one hiding his face from us. Again, why are the rabbis giving an interpretation of Isaiah 53 as the Messiah if it is only about Israel? Again, let's continue. And let Israel's kingdom be exalted in the days of the Messiah, of whom it is said, Behold, my servant shall prosper. He will be high and exalted, and lofty exceedingly. Again, why are the rabbis giving an interpretation of Isaiah 53 as the Messiah if it is only about Israel? What is to be the manner of Messiah's advent, and where will be the place of his appearance? And Isaiah speaks similarly of the time when he will appear, without his father or mother of the family being known. He came up as a sucker before him, and as a root of the dry earth, etc. But the unique phenomenon attending his manifestation is that all the kings of the earth will be thrown into terror at the fame of him. Their kingdoms will be in consternation, and they themselves will be devising whether to oppose him with arms or to adopt some different course, confessing, in fact, their inability to contend with him or ignore his presence, and so confounded at the wonders which they will see him work that they will lay their hands upon their mouth, in the words of Isaiah, when describing the manner in which the kings will hearken to him. At him kings will shut their mouth, for that which had not been told them have they seen, and that which they had not heard they have perceived. Again, why are the rabbis giving an interpretation of Isaiah 53 as the Messiah if it is only about Israel? It should be noted that just because we are quoting various rabbis, it does not mean that we necessarily agree with all of their doctrine and understanding. The purpose of citing them is strictly to prove that many rabbis already believe that Isaiah 53 is about the Messiah, not only Israel. Here's another. There is in the Garden of Eden a palace named the Palace of the Sons of Sickness. This palace the Messiah enters, and he summons every pain and every chastisement of Israel. And had he not thus lightened them upon himself, there had been no man able to bear Israel's chastisements for the transgressions of the law, as it is written, Surely our sickness he has carried. It has to be said again, why are the rabbis giving an interpretation of Isaiah 53 as the Messiah if it is only about Israel? Let's continue. The right view respecting this parashah is to suppose that by the phrase, my servant, the whole of Israel is meant. As a different opinion, however, is adopted by the Midrash, which refers it to the Messiah. It is necessary for us to explain in conformity with the view there maintained. The prophet says, the Messiah, the son of David, of whom the text speaks, will never be conquered or perish by the hands of his enemies. And, in fact, the text teaches this clearly. And by his stripes we were healed, because the stripes by which he is vexed and distressed will heal us. Us, meaning Israel. God will pardon us for his righteousness, and we shall be healed both from our own transgressions and from the iniquities of our fathers. Again, why are the rabbis giving an interpretation of Isaiah 53 as the Messiah if it is only about Israel? Another quote to consider. Who art thou, O great mountain? This refers to the King Messiah. And why does he call him the great mountain? The mountain here often prophetically means the kingdom or nation, referring here to the Messianic kingdom. Because he is greater than the patriarchs, as it is said, My servant shall be high, and lifted up, and lofty exceedingly. He will be higher than Abraham, lifted up above Moses, loftier than the ministering angels. Interestingly, in the letter to the Hebrews, it also states that Yeshua, following his resurrection, is now higher than Moses and the angels. Both Hebrews and the 9th century rabbis shared the same perspective on the Messiah, at least in this instance. Hebrews chapter 1. He, Yeshua, is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels, as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Hebrews chapter 3. For Yeshua has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as a builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. Moving on. This particular rabbi believed that Messiah ben Yosef and Messiah ben David are to be the same Messiah, linking the role of the Messiah that suffers for our transgressions in Isaiah 53 and the role reigning as king in Psalm chapter 2 verse 6. I have drawn him out of the chastisements. The chastisements are divided into three parts, one for David and the fathers, and one for our own generation, and one for the king Messiah. And this is that which is written, he was wounded for our transgressions. Again, why are the rabbis giving an interpretation of Isaiah 53 as the Messiah if it is only about Israel? Why are they linking Isaiah 53 to all other portions of Messianic texts? Let's continue. Rabbi Crispin states that in his understanding, Isaiah 53 is certainly about the King Messiah. In saying this, he not only declares this to be the obvious literal interpretation, but also the same position that is consistent with the other rabbis, meaning this: Isaiah 53 as a Messianic text is dominantly consistent with the other rabbis, at least until this point in history. Let's read. This parashah, the commentators agree in explaining of the captivity of Israel, although the singular number is used in it throughout, as there is no cause constraining us to do so. Why should we here interpret the word collectively, and thereby distort the passage from its natural sense? As then it seemed to me that the doors of the literal interpretation of the parashah were shut in their face, and that they wearied themselves to find the entrance, having forsaken the knowledge of our teachers, and inclined after the stubbornness of their own hearts, and of their own opinion, I am pleased to interpret it, in accordance with the teaching of our rabbis, meaning he is agreeing with the older rabbis, contrary to the modern and more dominant usage of Rashi, of the King Messiah, and will be careful, so far I am able, to adhere to the literal sense. It must be said again, why are the rabbis giving an interpretation of Isaiah 53 as the Messiah if it is only about Israel? Another, my servant shall prosper, or be truly intelligent, because by intelligence man is really man. It is intelligence which makes a man what he is. And the prophet calls the King Messiah my servant. So he believes the servant to be the Messiah, not Israel, speaking as one who sent him, or he may call the whole people my servant, as he says above my people. When he speaks of the people, the King Messiah is included in it. And when he speaks of the King Messiah, the people is comprehended with him. What he says then is that my servant the King Messiah will prosper. Here's another. Since the Messiah bears our iniquities which produce the effect of his being bruised, it follows that whoso will not admit that the Messiah thus suffers for iniquities must endure and suffer for them himself. Here is another rabbi that not only declares Isaiah 53 to be about the Messiah, but also declares that his view is consistent with the other rabbis. I may remark, then, that our rabbis, with one voice, accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet is speaking of the King Messiah, and we ourselves also adhere to the same view. The evidence just continues to mount that numerous rabbis, contrary to Rabbi Rashi's view, believe Isaiah 53 to be about the Messiah, not only Israel. The insight of this particular rabbi is quite astounding. The fact is that it, meaning Isaiah 53, refers to the King Messiah, who will come in the latter days, when it will be the Lord's good pleasure to redeem Israel from among the different nations of the earth. Whatever he underwent was in consequence of their own transgression, the Lord having chosen him to be a trespass offering, like the scapegoat which bore all the iniquities of the house of Israel. Concluding this section on Isaiah 53, it is certain that numerous rabbis believe that Isaiah 53 to be about the Messiah. However, modern rabbis admittedly rely mostly on Rabbi Rashi, which through anti-Christian sentiment has deliberately chosen to change the context of Isaiah 53 to only be about Israel. Psalm 22 is also another good portion to consider in the context of Messiah ben Yosef, our Messiah as the suffering servant. Recall what Yeshua proclaimed on the tree. Matthew chapter 27. And about the 9th hour Yeshua cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Yeshua cried this out right before his death. One might question what was going through his mind at that moment and the reason why he spoke these words. And we'll get to that. But before we do, we must note a couple more pieces of critical information found in the event of Yeshua's death. They casted lots for Yeshua's garments. Matthew 27. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. And they pierced Yeshua's side. John chapter 19. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. The reason they pierced his side was to make sure that he is indeed dead. The fact that blood and water came out meant that Yeshua had already died. The reason that they made sure that he was dead was because they were instructed to break the legs to accelerate death, thus assuring that the bodies could be removed and disposed on before the high Sabbath day, the first day of unleavened bread. When the legs were broken, the individual being crucified had to hold themselves up physically with their arms, just to get a breath and get air into their lungs. Obviously, you can only do that for so long, till strength gives out and then one suffocates under their own weight. It was a means to accelerate death. John chapter 19. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that all their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other that had been crucified with him. But when they came to Yeshua and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Yeshua was also mockingly told in Matthew 27, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him." So we learn that Yeshua's legs were not broken, and that lots were cast for his garments, and he was mocked and told to save himself. Again, all in the context of his death, when Yeshua cried out, my Lord, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27, and when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. Also keep in mind that given the circumstances Yeshua endured and the events leading up to and including the crucifixion, his strength would have been drained. He would have been massively dehydrated. The piercing of his side released water and blood. He was surrounded by evildoers, and his hands and feet were pierced. Try to keep all of this in mind as we continue. In the first century, Scripture did not have numbers and chapters. To refer to a particular portion of Scripture, they would cite a few words of it that most were familiar with. Knowing that, we realize that Yeshua is referring to Psalm 22 in the prophetic context of his death as a suffering servant aspect of the Messiah. Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, from the words of my groaning? O my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. And you, our fathers, trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried, and were rescued. In you they trusted, and were not put to shame. But I am a worm, and not a man, scorned by mankind, and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. On you I was cast down from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls encompass me, strong bulls of Bashan around me. They open wide their mouths at me, like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Because crucifixion was not heard of when King David wrote this psalm, and was not invented until centuries later, this makes the prophecy found in Psalm 22 particularly remarkable. Simply the sample of parallels we just illustrated should have been interpreted as highly compelling at minimum that Psalm 22 is a messianic prophecy. Others, however, have claimed that this psalm speaks of the sufferings of David when he was pursued by King Saul. Who then is right? Those are really our only two options to consider. Since Psalm 22 was written by David, it is understandable that one might believe that the psalm refers to him. However, the experiences described in Psalm 22 far exceed anything that ever happened to David. An example of this is found in verses 14 through 18. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircle me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. The things that happened here were never mentioned to happen to David. Some say that David was using hyperbole when describing the times when Saul pursued him. However, the sufferings are exactly what one would expect to occur when facing death at the hands of one's enemies, verses 16 and 20. These are not exaggerations. The one suffering is one being mocked for not a crime, but for trusting in God, verses 8 through 9. He trusts Yahweh. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breast. David is never described in Scripture as being restrained and mocked for trusting in God. Also, Scripture neither describes David as counting all his bones, verse 17, nor does it describe David's bones for being out of joint, verse 14. This psalm says a great deal about the suffering one, including, he feels abandoned by God, verse 1. He has trusted in God, verse 8. The Lord has been his God since birth, verses 9 through 10. There is a group of people who are mocking him for his trust in God, verses 7 and 8. He is hoping in the Lord, the God of his fathers, to deliver him, because there is no one to help him, verses 4 through 5, 11, and 19 through 21. Like we read in Isaiah 53, he is despised of the people, verse 6. His suffering is extreme, humiliating, and to the point of death, verses 14 through 17. His adversaries are described in vivid and terrifying ways, including many bulls, strong bulls of Bashan, roaring lions, dogs, and wild oxen. The sufferings described in the psalm specifically occurred during crucifixion, including bones being out of joint, the heart being like wax and melted, strength being dried up, and the tongue cleaving to one's throat. Verse 17 also states that he can count all of his bones. This is also stated in Psalm 34 in the context of his bones not being broken. Psalm 34, verse 20. He keeps all of his bones. Not one of them is broken. We know, of course, that Yeshua's bones were not broken. As already noted, the psalm describes numerous things that occurred during crucifixion. In addition, it describes additional things that specifically occurred at Yeshua's crucifixion. For example, in verse 18, it says that those present would divide his clothes among themselves by casting lots for them. Verse 1 includes Yeshua's quoted words at his crucifixion. However, the most dramatic description of a crucifixion occurs in verse 16. In some translations, the last part reads, "They pierced my hands and my feet." Other translations, including that of the Jewish Publication Society, translate the verse as follows, "Like a lion, they are at my hands and my feet." The key issue is, which translation is correct? If it says, "They pierced my hands and my feet," then here is a complete and vivid description of Yeshua's crucifixion, hundreds of years before crucifixion was even invented. To answer this question, one must look at 4 issues. Number 1, how do the vast majority of Jewish manuscripts translate this verse? Number 2, which translation is more in keeping with the context or better fits the surrounding verses? Number 3, which translation better fits the grammatical structure of the passage? And finally, number 4, does the Hebrew word in question exist in ancient literature? So let's answer these questions. How do the vast majority of ancient Jewish manuscripts translate this verse? Those who like to claim it says, "Like a lion, they are at my hands and my feet," cite the main Masoretic text to support their contention. However, many other Jewish translations translate this portion differently, including some manuscripts of the Masoretic tradition read, "They have pierced my hands and my feet." These are 2 later manuscripts of Kennicott and De Rossi of Ginsburg. This information is included in the apparatus of the Biblia Hebraica Septuagintia, bottom of page 1104. The older edition by Rudolf Cattell lists even more Hebrew manuscripts that say they have pierced or they have pierced. The Midrash on Psalm 22 says, "They have made my hands and my feet ugly," or hateful. The Aquila Jewish Greek translation reads, "They have disfigured my hands and my feet," while translation 2 reads, "They have bound my hands and my feet." The Targum, from the 1st century, reads, "They bite like the lion at my hands and my feet." The Symmachus text reads, "Like those who seek to bind my hands and my feet." The Syriac text reads, "They have pierced my hands and my feet." The Old Latin pre-Vulgate reads, "They have dug my hands and my feet." The Septuagint reads, "They have bore through my hands and my feet." It is important to note that the Septuagint was translated long before Yeshua came, so these Jewish scholars had no bias. Every version, except the main Masoretic texts, tells us that something happened to the hands and feet of the one suffering. They are either pierced, made to look ugly, bored through, bound, or bitten as by a lion. Of all the versions, only the 2 mentioned already say something else, something that has nothing to do with the hands and feet specifically. Only these say that the enemies are merely at the hands and the feet, while not doing anything to his hands and feet, such as biting, piercing, boring through, or binding. Which translation is more in keeping the context, or better fits the surrounding verses? The surrounding verses have all references to the body parts of the sufferer. For example, the bones are out of joint, verse 14. His heart is melted like wax, verse 14 again. His tongue clings to his jaws, verse 15, and he can count all of his bones, verse 17. All of these parts are being acted against. It makes perfect sense that in this song, the body parts of verse 17, his hands and his feet, would also be acted against. That is exactly what the vast majority of the different manuscripts say. The 2 exceptions literally read, "Like a lion, my hands and my feet." Not only is this an incomplete sentence, but the body parallelism found throughout the passage is broken, because nothing happens to the hands and feet, even though something happens to every other part of the body mentioned. The majority of the manuscripts appear to correctly preserve this symmetry. In addition, 4 metaphors are used to describe the sufferer's enemies. They are described as lions, dogs, bulls, and wild oxen. All of these animals kill their victims by piercing them. The lion and the dog bite with spike-like teeth, while the bull and oxen gore with their spiked horns. In fact, in verse 21, the speaker appears to be asking for deliverance from such piercing when he cries out, "Save me from the mouth of the lion. You have rescued me from the horns of the wild oxen." In addition, the context seems to suggest that the sufferer has already been pierced, as the people are not typically delivered from something that has not befallen them. The Hebrew phrase, according to the 2 main Masoretic texts, literally reads, "Like a lion, my hands and my feet." The obvious problem with this translation is that it's not a complete sentence. There's no verb, there's no infinitive, and there's no participle. That makes the phrase totally ambiguous. For example, technically it could mean, "My hands and my feet are like a lion." However, this would make no sense. Here the sufferer is in a weakened condition. He is not in any condition to attack like a lion. The passage makes it clear that he's a passive victim, not an aggressive lion. Technically, it could also mean, "A lion is like my hands and my feet." However, this also makes no sense in the context of this passage. The sufferer's hands and feet are not swift, strong, and ready to pounce like a lion. So again, which translation better fits the grammatical structure of the passage? The grammatical structure of the phrase in the 2 Masoretic texts occurs 7 times in the Hebrew Bible, including 6 times in Psalms, and in Job 33, verse 3. And in every case, except in Psalm 22, verse 16, the subject is clearly distinguishable from the object. For example, in Psalm 23, oil is the subject, and my head and my cup are the objects. But in Psalm 22, verse 16, under the main Masoretic rendering, one must guess as to what the subject and object is, with no reason to believe one is correct and another is incorrect. If the phrase is read, "They have pierced," it contains a verb. In addition, the confusion over the subject-object difficulty disappears. The verb in the perfect tense, past event with continuing effects, "They have pierced," fits the phrase well grammatically, unlike the alternative, "like a lion." Certain translations render the verse, "A mob of the wicked has encircled me like lions. On my hands and my feet I can count all my bones." However, this rendering does not fit the pattern of the song. The pattern of the verses is 3 sets of 3 words, with every set conveying a different idea. This pattern is easily discernible in verses 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, etc., However, if the phrase is translated, "They pierced my hands and my feet," the pattern of the verses is preserved. Here's another important question we should consider. Does the Hebrew word here meaning "they have pierced" exist in ancient literature? Some claim that the Hebrew word does not exist and Christians made it up. However, according to Keil and Delitzsch in their commentary on the Old Testament, Volume 5, page 318, and other manuscripts, the variant reading is found in the Hebrew text itself. Keil and Delitzsch point out that the addition of an aleph is also found in Zechariah 14, verse 10, and also Daniel chapter 7, verse 16. Thus, the additional aleph does not mean that the word is a Christian invention. Another important source introduced the Masoretical critical edition of the Hebrew Bible, Numbers 24, verse 9, in the margins of the Masorah Magna, states that the reading in Psalm 22:16 is indeed ka'aru. The author states that the word has two different meanings when comparing Psalm 22, verse 16, and Isaiah 38, verse 13. He also investigated the charge of scholarly fraud leveled against a printer of an early rabbinic Bible, and concluded that there was in fact ancient reading where Psalm 22:16 was ka'aru, "they have pierced." Finally, the reading of ka'aru as a verb in the perfect third person plural is preserved by the Midrash on Psalms, where they made it rendered, "they made hateful." Psalm 22 graphically depicts the sufferings of the Messiah in great detail, including his crucifixion. Verse 16 specifically indicates that his hands and feet would be pierced. The rendering, "they have pierced," or something similar, makes perfect grammatical sense, fits the context, and fits the poetic pattern of the passage. In addition, contrary to the claims of the critics, ka'aru does not exist in ancient manuscripts. However, the rendering by the two Masoretic texts is inaccurate. Like a lion, "my hands and my feet" is not a sentence. It does not fit either the context or structure of the passage, and it appears nonsensical. In addition, it is contrary to the vast majority of ancient Jewish translations. However, the fact that the Messiah was to be pierced does not hinge merely on Psalm 22. Zechariah chapter 12 states very clearly that the Messiah would be pierced or thrust through. No Jewish translation disputes that Zechariah 12:10 speaks of such piercing. This passage states that Israel will ultimately turn to this pierced one and will then be redeemed from all of her uncleanness. What certainly needs to be mentioned is that Yeshua is not the first Jew to be crucified by the Romans. However, in order for one to be slain for the transgressions of Israel, one must have never sinned against God, ever. And we learn that in the first teaching in the Brit Hadashah series, titled His Sacrifice, in which Moses tried to make atonement for Israel, but our Creator clearly said that Moses could not. Why? Because God said that anyone who has sinned against God will be blotted out of the book of life. Thus, Yeshua is the only person who is ever qualified to do what Moses tried to do, because Yeshua was different in such a way that he had never sinned against God. This concludes the portion of the teaching that covers Messiah ben Yosef as the role of the Messiah. In the second part of this teaching, we'll examine the Messiah ben David role of the Messiah in some detail. And in conclusion of this teaching, we'll examine the structure of the tabernacle and reveal how its design, hidden in the Torah, revealed the timing of both roles of the Messiah ben Yosef and the Messiah ben David. We hope that this teaching has blessed you, and remember, continue to test everything. Shalom.
Christmas and Easter, 2 days esteemed above most others, and are observed by nearly 1/3 of the human population. Millions of believers worldwide celebrate these holidays to honor the birth, death, and resurrection of the Messiah. These festivals take many cultural forms and shapes around the world. But would you be alarmed to discover that these two seemingly innocent holidays are historically rooted in ancient occult practices which can be traced back to Babylon? Babylonian sun god worship has evolved throughout the centuries and has branched out into several major religions. Many professing believers have also adopted several of these pagan customs unaware. Even today, all throughout Catholicism and daughter denominations, there are still dozens of popular monuments and symbols that were at one time dedicated to various sun gods. What became this very same organization also instituted Christmas and Easter. Secular and Christian scholars alike all record that the Christmas tree, wreaths, boughs of holly, and mistletoe were all objects used in pagan sun god fertility rites. This, of course, begs the question, what are they doing in the homes of believers today? Discover how Mithra and the Norse Odin evolved into the imaginary saint we know today as Nicholas, and how he became the key figure in the celebration of Christmas. In ancient folklore, St. Nicholas was accompanied by a dark counterpart known as the Krampus and had a striking resemblance to other false deities. The Easter Bunny and the dyeing of Easter eggs are also symbols of fertility connected to Ishtar, biblically referenced as the Queen of Heaven. Long before the birth of our Messiah, December 25th was a day used to celebrate the rebirth of the sun god. All of this and more has all been justified by man for hundreds of years. But when was the last time we considered what our Creator had to say regarding all of this? Do we care? Should we care? We reveal an opportunity and faith-centered challenge to worship and practice the faith as He stated He desires for all His people, not according to us, not according to men, but instead according to His way, according to His word. That is, if you are ready to test everything. To order this two-part teaching, visit testeverything.net or watch it for free in our video section.